Vlad the Impaler, the cruelest king and his twisted tortures. Dark strings fade in, thunder rumbles in the distance. They called him Tepes the Impaler, a name not earned in battle, but in what he did to the bodies of his enemies after the swords were sheathed. Vlad III of Wallachia, the man who would impale thousands slowly, deliberately, and while they were still alive, the man who drank blood from golden goblets beneath forests of twitching corpses, the man who would become legend, the man who would become Dracula. But Vlad was not a myth. He was a child born into fire, betrayal, and war. And his cruelties, as monstrous as they seem, were not random. They were forged in the same flames that burned his childhood to ash. The year was 1431. The place Transylvania, a land of snow-capped mountains, dark forests, and deeper politics. It was here, in a stone fortress rising over the town of Sigishora, that Vlad was born. His father, Vlad II Dracul, was a knight of the Order of the Dragon, a Catholic military order sworn to defend Europe against the Ottoman Turks. It was from this order that the name Dracul the Dragon came, and it was from Dracul that his son inherited the name Dracula, son of the dragon. But nobility offered no protection in Wallachia, only cruelty did. When Vlad was just 11 years old, his father handed him and his younger brother Radu over to the Ottoman Empire as political hostages, a twisted form of medieval diplomacy. It was a common practice at the time: give your sons to your enemies, so they won't invade you. The boy was sent to the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople. There, they were educated, groomed, and broken. Vlad was subjected to daily humiliation. His captors mocked him, beat him, and reminded him at every moment that he was not a guest, he was a living guarantee. They tortured his tutors. They executed disobedient slaves in front of the boys. And they made one thing clear: if Vlad's father defied the Sultan, the boys would die. He learned quickly. He watched how pain was used not just to punish, but to control. He saw how fear could reshape loyalty, and somewhere deep inside, the child began to become the monster. Meanwhile, back in Wallachia, chaos reigned. His father, Vlad Dracul, had grown weak. He tried to balance between the Ottomans and the Hungarian crown, but in doing so, he lost both. In 1447, Hungarian forces stormed Wallachia. Dracul was betrayed and killed. His eldest son, Mirza, was blinded with red-hot irons and buried alive. The young Vlad, still a hostage in Ottoman hands, learned of this fate, and something inside him snapped. The boy who had once dreamed of honor and knighthood now dreamed only of revenge. 2 years later, Vlad was released by the Ottomans not out of mercy, but calculation. They placed him on the Wallachian throne as a puppet. He was 17 years old and surrounded by enemies. The local boyar's powerful noble family saw him as weak. Foreign rulers considered him disposable. He would not stay in power for long, but his exile only hardened him, and when he returned as something else. By 1456, Vlad launched a military campaign to reclaim Wallachia. He struck fast, captured the capital Târgoviște, and took back his father's throne. But this time, he came not as a child, but as an executioner, and the executions would begin immediately. In his first months back in power, Vlad invited hundreds of boyars, the very nobles, who had betrayed his family, to a grand Easter feast. They dined well, they drank wine, and then he had them all arrested. The elderly were impaled. The younger ones were marched on foot to the mountains over 50 miles and forced to build Vlad's new fortress, Poenari Castle, with their bare hands. Most died from exhaustion, starvation, or exposure. The survivors became the foundation of his walls, literally. It was the beginning of a new kind of rule, one that didn't ask for obedience. It tore it from the bone. But this was just the prologue. The real terror, the horror that would sear his name into legend, was yet to come. A campaign of fear, blood, and iron that would turn forests into cemeteries, castles into butcher shops, and the name Dracula into a curse. Low drumbeat, winds through branches, distant screaming. It started with a stake, sharpened, oiled, driven into the earth, angled just enough to avoid piercing the heart, so the victim wouldn't die quickly, so the weight of their own body would drag them downward slowly, agonizingly, until the wood exited through the mouth, chest, or shoulder, sometimes after days of convulsing, shrieking, begging for death. And Vlad didn't stop at one. He created a forest, thousands of stakes, thousands of bodies, all left to rot in the sun, twitching, moaning, decomposing. It wasn't just execution, it was psychological warfare. In 1462, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed III, the same man who had held Vlad captive as a boy, marched with over 100,000 troops to invade Wallachia. He believed the campaign would be swift. What he encountered instead was a vision from hell. As the Ottoman army approached Târgoviște, they passed through miles of corpses, impaled men, women, and children, Serbs, Bulgars, Turks, some still alive, some just dead, all left in grotesque states of exposure, their faces bloated, birds feasting on open wounds, the air so thick with rot that seasoned soldiers vomited into their tunics. This was no accident. Vlad had timed it. He had staged it. Each body, each angle of the stake, each rank and row, meticulously arranged. It was his most horrifying masterpiece, a forest of meat and horror meant to break the enemy before a single arrow flew. It nearly worked. Contemporary accounts say Mehmed himself paused at the edge of the impalement field. He stared in stunned silence. He had conquered Constantinople. He had defeated kingdoms, but never had he seen such calculated terror. He reportedly said it is not possible to deprive of his country a man who does such things. And then he turned back. The Sultan, backed by tens of thousands, withdrew from Wallachia. Vlad had repelled an empire with corpses, but the impalements were not reserved for foreign invaders. Vlad used them on his own people, on criminals, on rebels, on merchants who cheated weights, on lovers who committed adultery, on wives who spoke too freely. One story tells of a woman whose husband complained that she didn't sew his shirts well. Vlad had her impaled, with the needle and thread still in her hand. Then told the man, "Let others see what happens when women neglect their duties." In another, he invited a group of foreign diplomats to court. When they refused to remove their hats, a gesture of respect, Vlad had their hats nailed to their skulls, alive. The message was always the same: obey or bleed. But Vlad's punishments were more than execution. They were ritual. Sometimes victims were boiled alive, skinned, dismembered, beheaded, then fed to animals, or disemboweled, then forced to watch their own entrails removed inch by inch. He once invited 500 sick, poor, and elderly citizens to a grand banquet, fed them wine and meat, then had the hall locked and burned down, with all of them inside. He told his advisors, "No one will be poor in my land anymore. Cruelty masked as order, punishment dressed in logic. But there was logic. Vlad's reign, as grotesque as it was, brought an unnatural peace. Foreign spies reported that merchants could leave gold in the open and no one would steal it. Criminals vanished from the roads. Villages slept soundly, knowing no thief dared cross Vlad's territory, because anyone who did ended up on a stake in an age of chaos. He had created control through blood, but it came at a cost. As his brutality grew, so did the enemies within. The boyars, still seething over their losses, the church, horrified by his excesses, foreign leaders hungry, the Papal States, the Holy Roman Empire who saw in Vlad both a crusader and a savage. Eventually, even the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus turned against him. In late 1462, Vlad was captured and imprisoned. For 12 years, he disappeared from his throne, his lands returned to corruption, and Wallachia once again fell into disorder. But Vlad's legacy didn't rot in chains, because when he was finally released in 1475, he came back one last time, and the stakes were waiting. Low cello hum, the sound of steel scraping wood. They say when Vlad returned from captivity, he was quieter, not softer, never that. Just slower, measured, like a man who knew his time was limited and intended to make every death count. It was 1475. He'd been gone for over a decade. The world had changed. But Wallachia had not. Corruption had crept back into the land. Thieves roamed the forests. The boyars, once crippled by fear, walked tall again. A puppet prince sat on the throne bought by Ottoman coin and Hungarian smiles. But now Vlad was free, and he had only one purpose: to cleanse what had rotted. He reclaimed the throne in blood. There was no coronation, no parade, only the echo of hooves and screams, Vlad's first decree revenge. He summoned the families of those who had betrayed him or had simply profited from his absence. He invited them to court under the pretense of a grand reconciliation, and then the doors were sealed. Some were impaled on the spot, others were taken to Panari Fortress, where they were boiled alive in pitch. Some were flayed, some were dismembered, but the worst were kept. These were the prisoners of art, Vlad's personal executioner's men trained not to kill, but to prolong would craft deaths that lasted hours, sometimes days. One man was tied naked to a wooden beam and had thin strips of skin shaved off his legs, then his back, then his face, while musicians played. Each time he screamed, the tempo rose. Another was placed in a wooden coffin lined with nails, then slowly tightened by ropes until the points sank into his flesh inch by inch. It took him 3 hours to die. For Vlad, these weren't executions, they were statements. But the enemies were not just nobles. The Ottoman Empire had not forgotten the forest of corpses, and now, with Vlad back on the throne, they feared another uprising. So they sent an army. Vlad, weakened in resources and allies, could not win by force. So he turned to the one tool that had never failed him: fear. He ordered entire villages along the Ottoman borders to be emptied. Men, women, children impaled. He left signs in Turkish, inviting the Sultan to visit his friends. He sent severed heads back as gifts. He burned the crops, poisoned the wells, released plague victims into the enemy path. He turned Wallachia into a trap, baited with blood and horror. The Sultan hesitated. His soldiers, many of whom had seen Vlad's works before, refused to march forward. It worked. For a time. but terror cannot hold forever, and eventually, even death comes for the Deathmaker. The circumstances of Vlad's demise are shrouded in legend, just as he would have wanted. Some say he was betrayed. Others say he was mistaken for an enemy and killed by his own men. Some even claim he lured his assassins in deliberately, fighting them tooth and nail before being run through with a dozen swords. But most agree on one thing. His head was cut off and sent to Sultan Mehmed II, preserved in honey. It is displayed on a pike at the gates of Constantinople, a trophy, a warning, but it did not erase the fear or the name, because Vlad the Impaler did not die with his flesh. He died into myth. What came after was chaos. Wallachia plunged into instability. Factions warred, borders shifted. But in taverns, in castles, in marketplaces, his name still drew breath. Parents threatened their children with it. Soldiers invoked it before battle, and poets, Eastern and Western alike, began to twist his story. They whispered he drank blood. They claimed he never died at all, that he returned at night, winged and pale, to stalk the forest he once ruled. And then, centuries later, one man gave that myth its final name, Dracula. But long before the vampire, there was the man, and the man was far more terrifying, because he was not undead. He was living, and choosing daily, deliberately to build a kingdom from fear. He did not feed off necks, he fed off silence, off obedience, off the stunned breath of a prisoner realizing no mercy would come. One final legend remains. They say in the ruins of Panari Castle, high in the Carpathian Mountains, you can still find rusted stakes, half swallowed by time and moss. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, you can hear it whistle through phantom screams. Whether true or not, one thing is certain: Vlad the Impaler never left history. He embedded himself into it, one sharpened pole at a time. Slow, eerie violin, a quill scratching parchment, whispered Latin chants. When Vlad died, his body rotted, but his name did not. It spread like wildfire, black, hissing, alive, through monasteries, into marketplaces, across mountains and borders, feeding on fear, growing stronger. By the late 15th century, Vlad's legacy was already larger than his life, and it was not just remembered, it was written, published, and deliberately, gleefully twisted. The first of these came not from Wallachia, but from Germany. In the decades after his death, printers in the Holy Roman Empire began churning out pamphlets, lurid tales of Vlad's punishments, his madness, his insatiable thirst for blood. They were printed cheaply, in bulk, with woodcut illustrations so grotesque they bordered on surreal. One famous image shows Vlad seated at a feast, calmly sipping from a goblet, while dozens of men and women hang writhing on stakes behind him. He dines alone, unbothered, at peace. The caption beneath reads, "He liked to eat among the dying and dip his bread in their blood." It wasn't journalism, it was propaganda, but it worked. The Germans had their reasons. At the time, Wallachia lay on the fault line between Christian Europe and the rising Ottoman Empire. The Saxons in Transylvania, many of whom were German immigrants, had clashed bitterly with Vlad over trade, taxes, and territory. So they painted him as a monster, a bloodthirsty tyrant who had gone mad with power. Their tales were picked up by other European printers in France, in Italy, in England. Each new version was more violent, more exaggerated, and less human. Soon, Vlad wasn't just a prince, he was a demon in royal robes. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the story took a different turn. There, Vlad was remembered not as a butcher, but as a savior, a man who stood against the unstoppable tide of Ottoman expansion, a ruler who brought order to chaos. Yes, he was brutal, but so were the times. Romanian folklore remembered him fondly. Ballads were sung in his name. Children were told that Vlad was watching, protecting, that he had never truly died. The contrast is stark. In the West, a fiend. In the East, a hero. But both views shared something in common. He transcended death. And then, in the 19th century, something happened. A novelist named Bram Stoker discovered a name in an obscure history book, Dracula. He was writing a gothic horror tale set in dark castles, filled with blood, bats, and eternal evil. He needed a villain who felt real, ancient, mythic. He found Vlad. He read the German pamphlets. He studied the Eastern legends. He absorbed the contradictions. And then he reimagined the prince not as a mortal man, but as something worse, the undead. In 1897, Dracula was published. The story of a vampire count who sleeps in a coffin, drinks blood, and spreads corruption through whispers and teeth. Stoker didn't include all the real atrocities, and he didn't need to. Vlad's name alone carried enough dread. From there, the transformation was complete. Vlad the Impaler had become Count Dracula, a name synonymous with evil in every language. What's astonishing is how the fiction and the fact blurred over time. Tourists in Romania still visit Bran Castle, advertised as Dracula's castle, but Vlad never lived there. Books, movies, and documentaries often show Vlad as a vampire, but ignore the real man whose punishment surpassed any monster of fiction. The real Vlad didn't bite necks. He didn't turn into bats. He didn't fear garlic or crucifixes. He was far more dangerous, because he was human, and he chose his cruelty. Methodically, rationally. Not because he thirsted for blood, but because he understood its power. Today, we watch horror films to be frightened in the dark, but Vlad's victims, they didn't watch horror, they lived it. They screamed beneath the stakes. They burned in silence. They prayed to a god who, in that moment, was not listening, and Vlad watched them, unblinking, creak of old pages, a fire crackling low. There's something to be said for stories, for the way we take men and turn them into myths, for how we dress murder in velvet and call it legend. But make no mistake, Vlad the Impaler was not a myth. He was flesh, bone, crown, and iron, and when he ruled, the earth itself remembered his footsteps. Deep silence, a shovel breaking cold soil, distant tolling bells. No one knows exactly where Vlad the Impaler is buried. No one, not for certain, and perhaps that's exactly how he wanted it. For a man who used death as a weapon, who built forests from corpses, and burned his enemies with royal calm, his own death became the greatest mystery of all. According to some accounts, Vlad was killed in 1476 during a skirmish with Turkish forces near Bucharest. Other stories say he was assassinated, cut down by his own men after a tragic case of mistaken identity. But the most commonly accepted version, he was beheaded, and his head, soaked in honey, was sent as a trophy to Sultan Mehmed II, who displayed it on a stake in Constantinople, the same gruesome method Vlad had used for thousands of others. Poetic, cruel, symmetrical. But what of the body? Here is where the shadows deepen. Historical records say his remains were buried at the monastery of Snagov, a small island sanctuary northeast of Bucharest. At the time, Snagov was surrounded by deep waters and ancient forests, a fitting tomb for a man whose life was cloaked in blood and isolation. For centuries, it was believed that Vlad lay beneath the stone floor of the monastery church, interred by monks who still feared him even in death. They say they nailed iron spikes through his robes, through his limbs, and into the coffin not to honor him, but to hold him down, a tradition in Romanian superstition. When a man is too wicked in life, he might try to rise again. But in 1931, archaeologists opened the alleged tomb. They found nothing, no bones, no royal garments, no body, just an empty pit. A second burial was located nearby, slightly off the axis of the main church, inside a few fragments of bone, a horse skull, and an assortment of weapons. Still, nothing definitive. And so the question has haunted historians for generations. Where is Vlad Dracula? Was his body hidden to prevent desecration? Was it burned, scattered, stolen? Some even believe he was buried in Napoca, or in Kamana Monastery, which he founded. Others, far more dramatically, believe that his body never stayed buried at all, that the stories of the nailed coffin weren't symbolic, they were warnings. Sound old iron hinges creaking open, the distant hiss of wind through pine. In Romanian folklore, the line between the dead and the undead is thin. Strigoi spirits of the dead who rise at night to torment the living were a real fear, long before Dracula was inked onto paper. To stop a man from becoming a Strigoi, villagers would drive stakes through the corpse's chest, place garlic in the mouth, bind the feet with iron wire, or decapitate the head and bury it separately. Some say Vlad practiced these rituals himself, not to protect the people, but to mock their beliefs. He knew that fear lived beyond death, that even a rumor could rot the heart faster than poison. He turned that fear into currency, and he spent it freely. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell. But the memory of Vlad Tepes did not fade. In the 19th century, Bram Stoker gave him fangs. In the 20th, cinema gave him cloaks and castles. In the 21st, his face graces t-shirts, documentaries, even postage stamps. He became a brand, a myth, a monster, so grand, so universally feared that the truth was forgotten. And maybe that's the most terrifying thing of all, because the truth is worse. Low thrum, a heartbeat, then silence. Vlad the Impaler didn't need to sleep in a coffin. He didn't need magic. He didn't hide in shadows. He was a man, a mortal, born of war, made by trauma, crowned in cruelty. And what he did not for hunger, not for survival. He did it because he understood the language of pain, because terror works. Look around. We no longer impale, not literally, or so we still obey out of fear, still believe in power shaped like horror, still stare, helpless, at those who smile while others suffer. Maybe Vlad didn't invent terror, maybe he just understood it first. And as for his bones, maybe they're gone. Maybe they were ground to dust, scattered in rivers, forgotten beneath the ruins. But maybe they're still there, in the cold stone beneath the monastery no one visits, bound in iron, waiting. And if you listen closely in the right wind, you can still hear them creak, not from decay, but from something else, something shifting,